the things my teachers have all spoken at length about is the difference between knowing and believing. Some people say that the middle word of believe is lie. Well, that's true. Because many people lie to themselves in order to maintain their belief. Such is the nature of the ego. Buddha lived about 2,500 years ago, and got himself into a lot of trouble. So he had his enlightenment experience, and he basically went round teaching people that there is a state within in which all seeking and questioning ends, and that God basically is a concept, and that everybody has a different idea of God or a different concept of God. With some people, God is an old man who lives on a cloud. For other people, it might be the controller of the matrix, or the thing that created a hologram. And science always gets involved in that. People always bring new ideas, the latest fad. Consciousness, perhaps we're living in a computer matrix, or, you know, God was a turtle or a volcano. And so it's the idea, the concept of God means many, many different things to many, many people. So Buddha saw into that, you see, and saw that people were believing in concepts or believing in the person that told them the concept, equally dangerous. So instead of believing other people, then find out for yourself. So Buddha came out with the phrase of believe no thing. And then he went round India and Nepal, basically preaching to people and training people and educating people about meditation and how they could free themselves and find God within, so to speak. So obviously some people were quite thrilled about this, but as you could imagine, the establishment at that time went like, who's this guy telling people that they don't need to perform expensive ceremonies and give gold to the temples and sacrifice animals? Who is this guy telling people that God is a state of consciousness that resides within every person and you could be a Buddha? My God, we've got to shut this guy up. He's going to ruin our business. So if you think about religion, it was the first corporate business. Equally as old as prostitution, but I think prostitution is more honest. Anyway, they tried to assassinate the Buddha. There was 2 attempts made on his life. One involving a wild elephant was released in a street, and the hope was that it would stamp the Buddha, and it didn't. He kind of made friends with the elephant. And there were other assassination attempts upon his life as well. You see, he threatened people's power and wealth. When you empower ordinary people, you see, that's always a threat to the establishment, which is why Jesus got nailed to a cross as well. It wasn't actually because he was a threat to the Romans. Pontius Pilate was saying, who is this guy who calls himself a king? He doesn't even have an army. He's got 12 disciples. See, the Romans weren't threatened by Jesus, you see, but the moneylenders and the people who owned the temples were, because he'd basically gone into a temple and whipped all the moneylenders the week before, which is probably what got him crucified, because he threatened the existing monopoly of God. So nothing's really changed. Anybody who comes out with any ideas that threaten the existing system is obviously going to get called certain names or perhaps even put to death. A more recent example, and one of my favourite human beings alive at the moment, is Graham Hancock. So back in the 90s, we used to sit and watch this TV programme called footprint of the gods. And Graham Hancock's thesis was that there had been a civilization that had existed in a long distant past that had measured the earth and had built temples in alignment with the stars all over the planet. So the archaeological people at the time and the historians were all laughing and saying that this was absolutely preposterous. But the guy had a very interesting theory. And the difference was with Graham Hancock compared with ordinary archaeologists and historians, you see, was that Graham Hancock and his friend Robert Bovell were looking at the stars and the sky as well as what was on the ground, whereas the boring, stuffy, educated archaeologists were just digging in the ground, so they'd never put the two and two together. This was the star correlation theory that they came up with, as well as this ancient maritime culture that had mapped the earth. So in Western society, you see, we were conditioned partly through history and partly through religion that nothing can be older than 6,000 years, because that's when the flood was and that's when the city of Ur came into existence. Well, you only have to spend some time in India and talk to Indian historians and Brahmins to know that that's nonsense, and that really the Indian civilization, the Hindu culture, is perhaps 25,000 years old. And there is archaeological evidence to support that, which Mr. Hancock found underneath the ocean. But the point of all this is, and now we know that Hancock was true because we've found cities under the ocean, and recently they discovered a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which is a 12,000-year-old stone structure that rivals Stonehenge. And we were supposed to just be primitive cavemen then, running around with sticks and stones. So Graham Hancock is a guy who had approached archaeology from a fresh perspective. He hadn't been indoctrinated in a university and given a strict set of beliefs that no, nothing can be anything but this, which means that people will discard evidence. And there's lots of evidence hidden away in museums all over the world that basically makes the theories proposed by historians rather preposterous. See, but nobody wants to upset the apple cart, and people have got degrees and mortgages and money to pay, you see. So what you find then is that the archaeological world isn't particularly honest, because when a new fresh idea comes along that threatens the established idea, it gets poo-pooed and pushed away. And then it took nearly 30 years for Mr. Hancock to be proved right. And it was the same thing with the Buddha, when he comes out with this revolutionary new idea. It's a threat to the existing society. And it's the same thing today. The same thing never stops going on, you see, because people's ego identify with a belief structure, and then anybody who attacks that belief structure, well, they're not attacking the person, but it's as if that person is having a physical attack upon themselves. And they'll dismiss that person and call them names, either a heretic or a conspiracy theorist. They won't actually listen to the arguments, but their ego will just go into a state of panic, and then they'll start calling people names because they're under threat. And in this way, the human race basically has made slaves of itself for many, many, many thousands of years. And ordinary people then, by clinging to the known and not investigating the unknown, have basically enabled slavery on this planet for thousands of years, and slavery to people's ideas. If we look at the ancient Mayans, so we all know how horrific they were with sacrificing people and tearing out people's hearts and all the rest of it. And how did they maintain such a draconian, dark, vile society where people had to pay in blood? Well, fear. And it works like this. You had an educated priestly class who knew about planets and who knew about the stars, and they knew that the moon passed between the sun and the earth and caused an eclipse. They knew it was to do with bodies moving in space. But the masses who weren't educated in astronomy, probably didn't even know how to read, you see, just believed the myth that the moon god was eating the sun god, and that unless you sacrificed your children and tore out their hearts, the world would be plunged into darkness and there'd be apocalypse. So I'm sure it was a great honour for them to sacrifice their children and pat themselves on the back and think, I'm doing my bit for society. Nothing changes, eh? So, in this way, by keeping the masses ignorant and by peddling a myth, they were able to maintain control. And I'm sure if one of the priests had have come forward and said to the people, hey, look, this is all a con, there's these things called planets and they move around in an orbit around the earth and it's nothing to do with the gods, they'd have probably called him a conspiracy theorist or a heretic and killed him. Nothing changes. But in this way, structures of control are maintained. And today it's done with scientific mumbo-jumbo. So today's priestly class are basically scientists. And they are the priests. And we've moved away from a democratic society now into a society that is scientifically managed. Good luck there, because when I was having my interviews at university, and I was at 24 years old at the time, I was facing a bit of a life choice, you see. The acid house parties weren't quite so good anymore. And I faced a choice between going to university, and I was going to study cybernetics, artificial neural networks and robotics, and human psychology, and to amalgamate those three to create a robotic mind. Or I could have bought a Triumph motorcycle, or I could have got on a plane and gone to India. Thankfully, I got on a plane and went to India. And one of the reasons was when I went to the course interview and I actually met the other students who were going to be studying artificial neural networks and cybernetics, I didn't want to even associate with these people. They were so hopeless and inept at social interaction. And I'm sure as they go through life and they got bitter with all the rejection, they can't wait to turn around and use all this technology against the people who rejected them all their life for being such geeks. But anyway, it's people like that, and thank God I went to India and not decided to be a scientist. But it's people like that who are basically running the world now. This scientific elite, and they're bamboozle people with scientific mumbo-jumbo and manipulating figures. And it's become quite a dangerous religion, because if you don't believe in it, if you actually don't believe what the scientists are telling you, it could cost you your freedom. So basically nothing's really changed since the days of the ancient Mayans. And one of the reasons that we accept all these systems of control is that we've been conditioned to be slaves over thousands of years. So if you're English, for example, you're watching this, then unless you are a lord or an earl, it's pretty much certain that your ancestors were peasant slaves who were either the property of the landlord, a serf, or lived through the Industrial Revolution and all the horrors that came with that, or they went and fought in wars and died for the rich and wealthy betters. So there's a slave mentality that is basically existent within the English culture, and I see it. I see it when people go waving flags and celebrating the people who enslaved them and raise them on a level and hold them to no account. This is terrible, terrible behaviour, and it's the behaviour of slaves. And it became deeply apparent to me when I came back from India. The culture shock I got was when I was wandering around England, because in England it's not really safe to go around smiling at people, because people think you're a nutter, or think that you're a beta male and want to beat you up or something like that. I don't know, there's a problem. Everybody's got to look miserable in England. You see, when I was in India, everybody seemed to be exuberantly full of joy and full of life, and it seemed that they had much harder lives than a lot of the people who were in England, but for some reason they weren't as miserable. And the reason why is conditioning. What people have been led to believe about themselves over the thousands of years. You see, if we look at what makes us, well, who we think we are, which is your personality is basically nothing more than an amalgamation of patterns of behaviour that you've adopted to fit into your society. So maybe you have to be the tough guy or the comedian or play the victim, anything that you've learned to manipulate situations to your advantage. Yes, playing the victim as well. A lot of people who play the victim all the time are playing the victim to manipulate other people. You see, when you don't look at yourself, you don't realise all the games that you play yourself and all the ways that we as ordinary people even try to control, manipulate and dominate each other. Fortunately, we don't have much power or wealth to be able to do that to large amounts of people, which the scientists and the politicians can do. You see, really, we're no different to them. And for most of us, if we were given all the power that they've got, we'd probably be even worse dictators than they are. So, Buddha realised all of this, you see, and he realised all the games that he played in himself and all the games that other people play, which is one of the reasons why he said, believe no thing. Always find out for yourself if something is true or not. He's not saying, don't believe the world, you know, don't believe that that's a plant, not like some of these neo-Advaita masters who go around telling you that the world is all an illusion. Wait till you're in a kitchen with one of them on your own and you threaten him with a rolling pin. And watch how he runs. Oh, hang on, you just said the world's an illusion. You're running away from me. Okay. Anyway, the world that our mind think it interprets is an illusion, which is why we should believe no thing and always find out for ourselves. You see, and because we all play games and play with knowledge and power and victims and belief and structures, then obviously the people in power are doing this as well. And they want you to believe the things that they believe because it keeps you in your place. And you learn all this at school, basically. What school teaches you to be is an obedient slave who doesn't think for himself. You see, you're conditioned to buy a bell, to move when a bell goes. That conditions you for working in a factory. Breaks by the buzzer, you know, clock on, clock off. Same thing at school. And they don't actually tell you how to think anyway. Schools these days seem to teach people what to think. Gandhi, who is another one of my heroes, famously said that people who know how to think do not need an education. And when you look at education, it's basically indoctrination, especially these days. It seems to be an extremely dangerous left-wing indoctrination that has basically torn the structure of Western society apart. Never mind, I'm sure somebody's benefiting from that and making money out of it. But the people never question their beliefs. So we have a society that conditions people to be slaves through the education system. Our ancestors were pretty much slaves who did what they were told. And here we all are. So how do we become free people and stop being slaves to other people and other people's ideas and beliefs? How do we learn to find out things for ourselves? See, this is of great spiritual importance, because one of the first things that Dennis, my teacher, used to sit and ask me, and the things he'd ask all of his students was, how do you know what you know? And for most people, I assume if you're watching this video and you've got this far, you're one of those people who's quite independent-minded anyway. But if we take the experience of most people, then everything they know is what someone else has said. There's a great song by The Who, 905. Pete Townsend wrote the lyrics. It's called 905. Every idea in my head, someone else has said. So this is important spiritually, you see, because Buddha said, believe no thing. So that forces us then, as mystics, to go through everything we know and look at it and to say, well, what is my experience? Do I know that, or do I believe that? And if we believe something, then we ask ourselves, why do I need to believe that? And you'll find that most of the beliefs basically are there because they make us feel less afraid. So instead of having to believing a load of stuff, what we do as mystics is confront the fear. And when you sit and confront the fear, then you don't have to believe in a load of stuff anymore. Many people think spirituality also is about reading books and learning lots of stuff, but they forget the most important thing. And this is in the Bible as well. It says, know thyself. I think that's the first command that God says. Know thyself. It's the same as Buddha, believe no thing. Know thyself means to know yourself, to know your mind, to know your games, to know your strengths and weaknesses, which is what we learn when we sit and meditate, and when we look at ourselves, and when we observe our minds. And I mean meditate in a particular way, which basically means the art of doing nothing. So if you're actually sat doing something, you see, and this is another thing with meditation, you read a load of books, and you go to a teacher and you believe everything this person tells you. Oh, if you do this, this will happen. But you never question the believer. So here's what happens. You'll go somewhere, you'll learn a mantra and spend the entire life doing a mantra. You're doing a mantra. That's not meditation. It's going to upset a lot of people. But how can it be meditation if I'm sat repeating a word over and over again? What I'm doing is focusing my intent on one thing. That is training the mind to go into a trough. When if we look at the teachings of Buddhism, when we look at people like Krishnamurti, and when we look at the teachings of the Qigong masters, everything has to be quite spontaneous and open and free. So it's very important then to question yourself and question everything, and to question everything you've been told, and to question your teacher, and to question your teacher's experience. So has your teacher ever experienced Satori? Or have they just been taught by somebody else who's been taught by somebody else who's read a load of books and has got a load of concepts and ideas? This is very important, and you need to ask yourself this. And you yourself, what do you believe? And who do you believe in? And why do you believe in them? Now, most people have been conditioned through the education system to give away their faculties of reasoning and thinking to people in suits or white coats. Well, these people have got mortgages to pay and lifestyles to maintain, and probably wives who like expensive jewellery and nights out. And so they might not always be acting in your interest. They might be acting in their own interest and feathering their own nest and just maintaining that belief with their scientific mumbo jumbo in the same way that the Mayan priests were doing. But the problem is most people believe them, and that's because of conditioning. They never stood a chance. They were born into a system of slavery, born of parents and grandparents who were slaves, and they went to a school where they learned not to think, but what to think and who to believe in. And when that has been ingrained into a person, what you're basically dealing with is a cult member. So I'm sure if you've been watching this video, you've probably been trying to talk sense to people about the existing situation that we find ourselves in. And if, like me, you've been attacked verbally and called all kinds of names and you're wondering why, well, Jesus said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Okay? Meaning they're heavily conditioned. They're in a scientific cult. It's basically rather like Jonestown on a national scale. And what you're dealing with is deeply conditioned cult members. But as Buddha said, believe no thing. Don't believe anything I'm saying. Please open your eyes and take a look around and see if what that screen on the television is saying matches your own experience. And remember, believe no thing except your own experience. And that is true mysticism. Because when we believe no thing but our own experience, it takes us out of the systems of mind control. You'll get called lots of names, and there's some quite interesting ones, everything from tinfoil hat to conspiracy theorist to selfish. And I'm sure they said all the same kinds of things about Buddha, and I'm sure they said all the same kinds of things about Jesus, Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus. Anybody who basically said anything that the system doesn't agree with has been in pretty much the same position throughout the history of humanity. But we're all still here. So believe in yourself. Have a nice day.